With the new millennium rapidly approaching, everyone is wondering what will happen and how the world and society will change. Paleontologist Jay Gould has written about evolution, about literature, about baseball, about biology, and now in this book, The Coming Millennium, he writes about time. The book is called Questioning the New Millennium, a Rationalist Guide to a Precisely Arbitrary Countdown. He joins me now for a conversation about this book and other things. As always, I am pleased to have him on this broadcast. Welcome back, sir.
Happy to be here.
Great to have you here. Now, the world ends when? The 23rd.
Well, the world ends tomorrow, October 23rd.
Right.
If you believe Archbishop Usher's calculations of 1650, thank God we don't, since geologists have found out the Earth's 4.5 billion years old
already.
But yes, according to the most popular of all the 17th century chronologies, it ends October 23rd, 1997, and that is in fact a date that comes right out of this whole millenarian issue that envelops us now, because the reason why all this business began is that the millennium, after all, is the future 1,000-year reign of Jesus after his return on earth.
Right.
And he made it quite clear in the Gospels that he was going to come back pretty soon. He says at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, there are some of you standing here today who will still be alive when the Son of Man comes into his kingdom. And then it didn't happen. So when it didn't happen, people had to figure out how they got the date wrong. And they came up with this really kind of interesting metaphorical theory that since many biblical passages state that one day with the Lord is as 1,000 human years, they reasoned, Psalm 90 and other passages, they reasoned that since God created in 6 days and rested for a seventh, that meant the earth could endure for 6,000 years. That is 6 of God's days, which you would then count in increments of 1,000 years or millennia, yes. And then Jesus would come again, and then you'd have the millennium, the 7th day, the 1,000-year period of rest. So if you could only figure out when the earth began, then you'd know when it would end, because it would be 6,000 years later. And that's why all these 17th century scholars did these various calculations, the most famous of which was Archbishop Usher, mid-17th century, who determined 4004 BC, October 23rd at noon, as the date of creation. Now, since there was no year zero, we can get to that later. 6,000 years later is October 23rd, 1997 at noon.
Did we think it was October 1996 for a while?
We did. A lot of people. A great thing happened on that day, as you will remember. That's the day the Yankees won that miraculous victory in Game 4 of the World Series. So I think in a sense it was a signal.
And none remember so sweetly as you.
That is true. Wade Boggs' walk with the bases loaded, the greatest act of thinking baseball in modern history. But since there was no year zero, you see, when the 6th century monk Dennis the Short, Dionysius Exiguus, established the BC AD system, he made a little mistake. Well, it wasn't a mistake, because there was no zero in Western numerology at the time, but time goes from 1 BC right into 1 AD. There was no year zero in between, which there ought to be. That's why we have this endless issue about whether the millennium starts in 2000 or 2001. But as another consequence of that, since year zero is missing, if you count forward from 4004 BC, it doesn't go to 1996, as you might think, but to 1997, which is why the world's going to end then.
Why are you interested in this?
I'm interested in this because it's ironic. It's precisely because it has no scientific meaning. There's nothing in the world outside, nothing in the cycles of the sun, the earth, the moon, that goes by 1,000. Therefore, it's simply a meaning that we have imposed upon the world. Nothing in nature counts by 1,000. We count by 1,000, I guess, because we have 10 fingers, so we invented decimal mathematics. But we have 10 fingers as an evolutionary accident. The first terrestrial vertebrates had 6 to 8. And anyway, even with 10 fingers, that doesn't give you a decimal mathematics. The Mayans developed a wonderfully complex mathematics based on 20, and they had plenty of cycles. I guess they counted fingers and toes, but they had cycles of 20 and 400 and 1,600, but no thousands. The cycling by 1,000 is entirely a human decision, and I think therefore it's an essential fact of humanism. It illustrates, I guess I'd put it this way: we live in a world that's largely chaotic, often very sad, rarely matching our hopes, and we have to impose some order. We have to wrest some order from this sad chaos of the universe, and we do it by imposing regularities from inside our head. The mind is a pattern-making machine. It doesn't do well with the randomness out there. After all, we think there are constellations in the sky because the stars are at random. We're always trying to find pattern where it doesn't exist. So to me, this is a pure example of human foibles, human motivations, human needs. And to that extent, it's very interesting.
Did you go to a publisher and say, I want to write about this, or did somebody call you up looking to... Here's my second scenario. A publisher thinking all the Millennium books, Jay Gould's there, he knows how to write about anything. and especially this kind of inquiry. Let's call him up and see if he'll do it.
No, it wasn't that. Actually, it began because I had written an essay in my regular series on the 2000 versus 2001 issue, and then it occurred to me that there's so many millennial books, and most of them are 600 pages long, and they're full of nonsensical predictions about an absolutely unpredictable future and deep psychological analyses of fantasy, angst. And I thought, look, there are a few simple questions. What is the millennium? When does it come? Why are we so interested? That seems small, but if you want to discuss big issues, it's better to get at them through little things.
And so you discover...
and then I put it together.
Yeah.
Also, all my life, for a reason that I don't understand, I have been fascinated with calendars and calendrical regularities. I tell an incident in there that when I was 8 years old, the first issue for Life magazine, that quintessential organ of middle-brow culture, came to our house every week. The first issue for 1950 celebrated the end of the first half century of our century, although maybe it should have been 1951 if you take that position. And I just thought at 8 years old, this is wonderfully interesting. And it occurred to me that I didn't know the word millennium or the concept or its history. I'd probably be alive in 2000, and that would be a great privilege. And somehow that has motivated me all my life. I don't know why.
I'm not going to let you get away without talking about this subject, because it just occurred to me. I've been asked to do a series of things having to do with selecting the most influential people of the century in medicine, science, politics, sports, the arts. If you had to select 5 most influential people in science for this century, who would be on your list? Just on your list, without asking you to name 3 or 10.
It's just so hard to know because we can't predict what's going to seem to be important in the future. If you want to talk about influence through our century, there's some obvious names
Einstein,
like Einstein, who you can't leave out. You've got to... Also, science is so collective, you hardly know who to memorialize. Do we take Watson and Crick for DNA, or do we take any number of others? Clearly, DNA and its understanding. Or do we take Linus Pauling, who came so close and who did so much else? I think so often we take what is really a collective enterprise and try and exemplify it by individual achievement. That's really very hard, since science is a collective enterprise. But the 2 things that come most to mind are the physical revolution, and let Einstein stand for it, and
equal MC square and DNA.
And the DNA revolution, and let Jim Watson and Francis Crick stand for it. That's fine. But we've had great increments in our understanding of evolution as well. But who do you pick? Dobzhansky, Meyer, Simpson, J.B.S. Haldane, R.A. Fisher. There are many great names.
Is there one great paleontologist?
Would have to be George Simpson. Again, not a household name, but the great paleontologist of this century.
Yeah. When you do these books, do they bring the same kind of satisfaction as the other books bring you?
Oh, very much so.
Because it's whimsical?
You see, in one sense, it is whimsical and it's trivial, but I think one thing essayists have known ever since Montaigne is, how do you write? Suppose you want to write on the nature of truth. If you just attack it head on, it's going to seem tendentious and arrogant and ridiculous. What an essayist understands is the way you get at large subjects. You take a jewel of a tiny thing that can be answered. And that's why little foibles, little tricks, little tiny things can cascade into bigger meanings. And no, I take this as seriously as anything I've ever written.
And with more fun.
Yes, it was fun.
More fun. Let me ask you about a couple of things here, then we'll get to some of the other subjects. One is the dedication here. In loving memory of my friend Carl Sagan, the most passionate rationalist of our times, the best advocate for science in our millennium. The best advocate for science in our millennium.
I can't think of anyone better as a public figure.
As someone who said science...
But his Cosmos series reached more people than anything that any scientist had ever done, and it reached people by establishing and correctly describing the essence of the excitement of science. So, yes, in part it was the access to media that he had, which no one could have in the past, but I'll certainly stand by that.
Yeah, I would too. He was a great friend of this program.
And a great friend of mine, and a man who would have loved to see the Millennium and what came with it. And maybe he's watching from somewhere.
We certainly have. The other thing is that you talk about Einstein, and you talk about an amalgam of his 2 most famous quotations. What are they?
Oh, first, that God is maybe subtle, but he's not malicious. And secondly, that God doesn't play dice with the universe. Now, both of those are often misinterpreted. Einstein was not a theist. Those were metaphorical statements about universal order. By saying that God doesn't play dice with the universe, he was stating his own belief, which I think was wrong, by the way, in a more deterministic universe than I think exists. And by saying that God is subtle but not malicious, he simply meant that the universe is difficult to understand, but it's not perverse. That is, it is comprehensible, and it is understandable.
When you began this inquiry, what was the most surprising thing you found? Into all of the falderall about...
I guess I hadn't realized before I started how compelling, I mean, I knew it was true. There is one constancy in the history of apocalyptic thinking, which is where all this millennial business comes from, and that is that every predicted date for the apocalypse fails. I mean, I knew that, of course, but I hadn't realized the extent to which that influences history, because every time that happens, you have a large group of true believers who have rejected social relationships.
But do they do something?
Often they do.
Something that has consequence for the rest of us?
Sometimes. Often they just creep down their hillsides back to their towns and lick their wounds. But sometimes, as when the greatest millenarian group in America collapsed in the 1840s, the Millerites, some of them go on, and the Seventh-day Adventists branch off from one group, and the Jehovah's Witnesses branch off in another group, and they're very much still with us if you follow out the skeins of history.
Is there something about all of us here? It is a search for myth to make life comprehensible.
Make it comprehensible and to make it kinder. I think the reason why I have apocalypticism, it's no mystery. Apocalyptic folks are those who see themselves as downtrodden and suffering and have no way in the ordinary earthly scheme of things to overcome that. Powerful religions that hold secular might are never millenarian. In fact, the Catholic Church, when it became official, had to interpret itself around the former apocalyptic beliefs, and St. Augustine argued that the millennium was therefore only a metaphorical state into which the Church had already entered at the Pentecost. So there are ways around it.
I was amazed to know when I was in Egypt that they had said to me, this was like last year, they're already booked, completely full, for people who want to come to the Nile and to Cairo and to the Nile Valley and to Aswan, to be there, and to Luxor, to be there for the millennium. And they want to be that place. They want to be near a pyramid. I mean, it's just...
Yeah, Times Square hotels have been filled for years.
Yeah, and same thing. But Times Square, it is a traditional place to celebrate the New Year.
I don't know under what
being next to a pyramid. I mean, maybe where would you go if you were going to go that far and choose a place to go? If somehow you could find meaning in being somewhere when the century ticks off. First of all, you got to accept the date that it happens or the time that it happens.
That's another issue.
That's another issue. But let's take the traditional.
No, I'd rather be just in my own living room with my loved ones. There's no significance to being any particular part of the world, since after all, given the nature of the Earth's rotation, you're going to hit January 1st, 2000 everywhere eventually. Where you hit it first is merely a convention of the international dateline anyway, so who cares?
If you had not chosen the life of academia and writing and scientific inquiry, what might you have done?
Oh, if I'd had a terrific voice, I would have loved to have sung Wotan at the Met. If I had a better body, I would have loved to have followed Joe DiMaggio in center field, but they had this guy named Mantle, so I'd never had a shot at it.
Yeah. And what else? Anything else? Any other boyhood fantasies?
Linguistics.
Really?
But I'd say Carl Sagan, I believe in a kind of determinism. Both Carl and I both grew up in New York, me in Queens, him in Brooklyn, and we both were fascinated with two subjects, astronomy and biology. I like to think it's a kind of physiological determinism. I'm short and Carl was tall, so I figured he ended up with astronomy and I ended up with geology.
Physiological determinism.
But
that was it, was it?
I think that's what it was.
You're sad the Yankees are not in the World Series, obviously.
Indeed.
And are you an American leaguer who says go Indians or what?
I guess so, but I frankly have no enormously abiding interest in this series. I'm an American League fan. I like the old 8-team league, so I'll stick with the Indians.
Have you seen
I still feel badly that they lost in 4 straight to the New York Giants in 1954 with the world's greatest pitching staff of Lemon, Wynn, Garcia, and Feller.
Yeah.
I won a lot of money. I won $14 at 4-to-1 odds. Boy, did I think I was rich betting on the Giants.
And that was the world's best pitching staff, you think?
Absolutely, except for the Atlanta Braves, who never seem to be able to put together.
Stephen Jay Gould's book, Questioning the Millennium, A Rationalist Guide to a Precise Arbitrary Countdown. As always, thank you, sir.
Thank you,
Pleasure.
Charlie.
We'll be right back. Stay with us.